The sun over Cape Town, a city sprawled at the foot of the magnificent Table Mountain, always gifted the streets with an intricate play of light and shadow, as if breathing life into a mosaic of flickering glints and deep, mysterious patches. But in August 2007, the shadows grew far more dense, steeped in a horror that even the brightest South African noon could not dispel. In one of the quiet, once serene suburbs, where the lush greenery of gardens harmoniously coexisted with neatly trimmed lawns, a tragedy unfolded, forever etching Lynette Wolshenk's name into the grim chronicle of South Africa's criminal history. The country, known for its richest culture and breathtaking natural beauty, is also a place where one of the most painful modern problems, gender-based violence, manifests with particular intensity. The murders of women, often committed with exceptional, perverted cruelty, have become a sad reality. And Lynette's case is one of those that made society flinch, listen, and try to understand. How could this have happened? Lynette was not just another victim. She was a woman, a loving wife, a person adored by her loved ones. Her story, before it was cut short so terribly, was a story of ordinary life, filled with cherished hopes and bright plans for the future. She lived in her cozy home, in a suburb where, it seemed, an unshakable peace reigned. But behind this deceptive outward serenity often lie the darkest, most unpredictable sides of human nature. Late on the evening of August 24th, 2007, as the city slowly drifted to sleep, an unforeseen event unfolded at Lynette's home. The scene that emerged was so horrific, so grotesquely inhuman, that it shocked even against a backdrop of grim, often brutal crime reports. The discovery of Lynette's body was a true nightmare for those who first encountered the ghastly tableau. The signs of violence were undeniable, speaking of an unimaginable cruelty. Her body had not simply been killed. It had been dismembered with a ferocity that suggested a perpetrator, consumed by all-encompassing hatred, had plunged far beyond the bounds of reason. This savagery, this seemingly ritualistic brutality, hinted at something far deeper than a mere impulsive act of aggression. This was a case that demanded not only thorough investigation, but a deep dive into the dark corners of a criminal's psyche, into the abyss from which they emerged. The local police, confronted with such unfathomable brutality, immediately recognized they were dealing with no ordinary crime. Lynette Wolshenk's murder was not simply an act of violence. It was a cry from the deepest strata of a society grappling with an unceasing tide of gender-based violence. In South Africa, a nation that had navigated decades of apartheid and strived for justice and equality, the issue of violence against women remained one of its most grievous, unhealed wounds. Statistics painted a grim, undeniable picture. Women in South Africa were falling victim to attacks, rapes, and murders on a scale that shocked the entire world. Strikingly, these horrific crimes were often perpetrated by those known to, and perhaps even trusted by, the women themselves. An investigation began immediately, commencing in the very first hours after the tragedy was discovered. Every corner of the house, every minute detail, every potential witness, all were subjected to the most painstaking scrutiny. A palpable fear hung in the air, saturated with a sense of oppressive, unbearable injustice. The detectives, including those from the country's black majority, who had themselves lived lives marked by a long struggle for rights and dignity, understood perfectly how crucial it was, not only to track down and apprehend the ruthless killer, but also to bring some measure of solace to the grieving family and the entire tormented society. They recognized that behind each such crime lay not merely one embittered individual, but a complex web of deeply entrenched issues: socioeconomic inequality, broken lives, and perhaps even hidden psychological disorders that had remained unnoticed until now. One of the very first, and likely most challenging tasks facing the investigation was identifying the perpetrator. Was it a stranger who had managed to infiltrate the residence undetected? Or perhaps a neighbor? Or even someone from Lynette's innermost circle? The absence of obvious signs of forced entry, for instance, could suggest that the killer either knew the victim or, at the very least, had access to the home without drawing any attention. Anyone who had any sort of encounter with Lynette immediately became the subject of her intense, scrutinizing gaze. Among those who fell under this focused attention was Martin Wolshenk, Lynette's husband. As often happens in such complex narratives, the spouse is always among the first to be suspected. However, unlike many other situations where suspicions are confirmed, here everything turned out to be much more intricate and convoluted. Martin, undoubtedly, was experiencing profound grief, but his behavior, his emotional reaction to the tragedy that had occurred, along with certain seemingly minor facts from his past, began to raise more and more questions for the investigators. The social and cultural context of South Africa at that time played a very tangible role. In a society where gender roles were often rigidly prescribed and women's rights were frequently infringed upon, numerous cases of violence remained unsolved. This happened due to victims' fear of condemnation, their apprehension about losing their reputation, or simply a complete lack of trust in the work of the law enforcement system. Lynette, within her marriage, could very well have been facing similar problems, invisible to the eyes of outsiders. The case began to gain momentum when the first, albeit hesitant, clues started to emerge. Investigators, demonstrating incredible meticulousness, searched for any clues, however minor, attempting to piece them into a cohesive picture. Extensive interrogations and thorough examinations were conducted, and all conceivable motives were analyzed. Gradually, through a tangled web of contradictions and outright lies, a figure began to emerge, one that increasingly fit the profile of the perpetrator. This was no ordinary murderer. This was a person whose own life seemed to have been twisted, whose psyche was undoubtedly broken, and who perhaps found some perverse, chilling satisfaction in committing this monstrous crime. The key figure who began to unveil the dark secrets of this convoluted case was the lead investigator, a man whose unwavering persistence and impeccable professionalism were known to all. Perhaps he himself was a son of this soil, having experienced firsthand the hardships and unbearable injustices so often faced by Black South Africans. His sharp gaze, capable of piercing through layers of deceit and carefully hidden omissions, became the very light that slowly but inexorably broke through the deepening darkness. During the investigation, it became abundantly clear that Lynette's death was no simple, random turn of events. Undeniable evidence surfaced, suggesting she may have been subjected to sophisticated blackmail or cruel extortion just before the murder. These new clues added a completely new, frightening dimension to the crime, hinting that the killer acted not only from base, animalistic urges, but perhaps also harbored some very specific, sinister objectives. The psychological portrait of the criminal, which had gradually begun to emerge in the investigators' minds, was truly frightening. Before them stood a man whose soul seemed to have been consumed by deep-seated complexes and a sharp sense of his own inadequacy. It was likely this inner turmoil he tried to drown out by resorting to violence. His true motives, if they could even be called such in the commonly accepted sense, lay hidden in the darkest, unexplored corners of his mind. But one thing was perfectly clear. He posed a deadly threat, and he had to be stopped. One of the most tragic and complex chapters in the annals of this case became the role of the husband himself, Martin. He found himself at the epicenter of crossfire. both under the close suspicion of the investigation and under the ruthless pressure of public opinion. Every action he took, every word he spoke, every story he told, all were subjected to merciless, detailed analysis. As often happens when a human life becomes a backdrop for a true criminal drama, his own existence transforms into a continuous trial. Every step he takes, every word he utters, is evaluated under a magnifying glass, in the glare of unforgiving spotlights. As the intricate details of this complex case began to sharpen into focus, it became clear that this was far more than a mere ordinary murder. The case emerged as a stark symbol of a far broader and more painful issue, one that pierced the very heart of South African society: the pervasive problem of gender-based violence. Lynette Wolshenk's story ceased being simply an account of one horrific crime. It transformed into an unflinching mirror, reflecting the countless struggles and dangers women faced daily in this nation. Lynette, like so many others, had fallen victim not only to physical violence, but perhaps also to an unseen, yet equally devastating, psychological burden. Her internal battles, her pervasive fear, and possibly a deeply ingrained shame, all of it might have preceded those horrific events that transpired on the 24th of August. Now, with her voice silenced forever, the utmost effort remained to comprehend what she endured and to ensure her story would not be erased from memory. At one juncture, when the investigation seemed to have reached a complete impasse, something entirely unexpected occurred. Like a ray of light in profound darkness, new evidence surfaced, and witnesses were found whose testimonies proved crucially important. These were not merely scattered fragments of information, but links in a chain, leading with certainty to one individual. Finally, this person was identified as the prime suspect. This was an individual whose life seemed built upon a foundation of inherent malice and a drive for destruction. And then, just as the triumph of justice felt within reach, as the criminal stood on the precipice of exposure, another truly tragic turn of events occurred. Cornered, under unbearable pressure, the culprit took one last, desperate step. He took his own life. This was an end that, on one hand, brought a welcome relief. The murderer no longer posed any threat. But on the other hand, it left behind a multitude of unresolved questions. Why had he committed such a terrible deed? What exactly drove him, compelling him to such a dreadful act? And, perhaps most importantly, what had led him down such a dark, fated path? The criminal's death, certainly, could not erase the sharp sting of pain from Lynette's loss. She did not bring her back to life, nor did she heal the deep wounds inflicted upon her family. However, she did, at the very least, put an end to this particular soul-crushing nightmare. And, perhaps more significantly, she compelled society to once again reflect on how to prevent such tragedies in the future. The repercussions of this case were truly profound and far-reaching. This story ignited a new, powerful surge of discussion surrounding the gender-based violence so deeply rooted in South Africa. It drew widespread attention to the urgent need for more effective measures to protect women, to the pressing task of eradicating the very social and cultural underpinnings that unfortunately fuel the disturbing prevalence of violence. Beyond this, the events vividly highlighted the paramount importance of mental health care and the timely provision of qualified assistance to all who suffer from emotional trauma and psychological distress. The case of Lynette Wolshenk became one of those turning points that painfully remind us of the fragility of human existence, of how easily and suddenly life can be extinguished. It served as another bitter testament that even in our planet's most picturesque corners, beneath the gentle rays of the bright sun, sinister shadows can lurk, filled with unspeakable horror. And perhaps the most crucial, most pressing question that remains after all these tragic events have concluded is this: how can we ensure that stories like these never happen again? How can we together build a society where every woman feels completely safe, where her voice is not just heard, but truly heeded, and where her life is valued above all else? The answer to this pressing question, I believe, lies not only in the clear and effective work of law enforcement and the justice system, but also within each of us, in our personal readiness to resolutely stand against violence, in the depth of our empathy for the suffering of others, and in our unwavering faith